Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Tim Gocher is the founder and CEO of Dolma Fund Management, the first international private equity firm to focus on empowering Nepal's startups. Under Tim's strategic leadership, Dolma has successfully raised over $100 million in two funds and created over 15,000 jobs in Nepal and other developing countries. Tim has pioneered renewable energy investment throughout Asia. He is also founder and chairman of Dolma Foundation, a charity focused on fostering education-related changes in Nepal. Hello, Tim, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to join you.
We're really glad you could join us today, and we want to start at the beginning of your adventures in Nepal. You were the first to establish a private equity firm in Nepal through Dolma Fund Management and have recently also launched Dolma Climate Fund. What opportunities inspired you 2 decades ago in a market that hadn't been tapped by private equity?
Well, Paul, I wish I could give you a macroeconomic analysis answer, but the truth is I fell in love with the country. And if people have traveled there and witnessed the peace and the culture, I think they'd probably join me in that. But actually, from a market perspective, it's a country of 30 million people. It's the same population as Malaysia. And sandwiched between India and China with massive investment opportunities, it's often overlooked. So I decided to really just focus on Nepal. And I found incredible opportunities in technology. We have 2 AI companies in our portfolio, one of which is about to list on NASDAQ. We're the largest investor in healthcare, in hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and pathology services. And what we're going to talk about today, of course, which is the vast need for renewable energy.
Yes, so let's jump right into that part of our program. Could you shed some light on the specific environmental challenges Nepal is currently grappling with, particularly in the context of global climate change?
Well, Nepal is the 4th most vulnerable country to climate change, and that's largely because of the Himalayan glaciers you see behind me. Mm-hmm. They're melting at an alarming rate. The glacial melt of Everest is projected the mass will disappear by up to 60% by 2050 and over 90% by 2100. Now, a lot of that melt is caused, of course, by global warming, but also by black carbon pollution, which is the soot, the dark particles emitted by coal-fired power stations in India, and by people burning a lot of firewood because there's not enough electricity. So the interesting thing about that is that black carbon can be overcome in one winter's snowfall. If I woke up tomorrow and Nepal had 20,000 megawatts and was exporting to neighboring countries, enabling India to turn off those coal-fired power plants, that effect would go away overnight. So it is a terrible problem, but it is solvable.
Tim, in 2014, you launched Dolma Fund Management, and the 2 Dolma Impact Funds that have opened and have been funded since then have raised more than $100 million, as we mentioned before, largely through the support of DFIs, including the British International Investment, the Netherlands FMO, and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Why are these types of development finance institutions so interested in the work that you're doing in Nepal?
Well, they're the ideal investors at this stage of the country's development. So a development finance, for example, the US DFC, is a sovereign, effectively a sovereign wealth fund, but it can take more risk. So the journey we are on at Dolma is to head towards bringing in large-scale, long-term international institutional investors, private sector investors. Now, they need a track record. they need to see, if they were going to invest in renewable energy, they would need to see 10 years of returns, for example.
Yes.
They're managing your and my pension and life insurance.
Right.
And where development finance institutions come in is they can take risk. They're still very much for profit, but they can take risk where institutional investors can't. So that's why our first two funds are dominated. As we go forward with our new fund, now that we have a strong returns track record on renewable energy, we will be approaching institutional investors.
Okay, so now that we're on to renewable energy, as you just stated, Dolma has made major investments in Nepal's renewable energy sector. What role do you believe these international institutional investors should play in developing sustainable energy solutions, and how can they drive measurable impact in frontier markets like Nepal?
Well, Nepal needs $46 billion to build out its infrastructure for energy, its generation capacity to 28,000 megawatts, which will be enough to both meet its domestic potential and export 10,000 megawatts to India and 5,000 megawatts to Bangladesh. Now, Nepal's government, of course, has very small amount of funds. Local banks and investors have some money, but nothing like $46 billion over the next 10 years. And so the only solution is for institutional investors to come in. I think when approaching them from a frontier market, you've got to respect their fiduciary duty. So Nepal doesn't have a sovereign credit rating, for example. It doesn't have international bonds in the market. It does have some benefits. It has a very low level of debt to GDP. It has got a 30-year track record of independent power producers and PPAs with no default. It has no default to any international obligation. But it's still underdeveloped. And so I think the way to come in for the big institutions, whether that's through equity or debt, is to use some of the guarantee or insurance facilities put up by, for example, MEGA, the insurance arm of the World Bank. Guarantco provide a AA- rated RAP, and we're working with them on a green bond project. And then, of course, there's blended finance and concessional finance that can provide a first loss. Mm-hmm. So I think the first entry of the big institutions will be through that. Why would they do it, apart from the promising financial returns, is the huge impact. The huge impact, if we build more solar plants in Spain, it's going to have a positive impact. If you build more solar plants in Nepal, people are going to switch the lights on for the first time. Children can do their homework. Women aren't collecting firewood. It has a fundamentally more important impact than to a developed country.
So, Tim, you just mentioned several other countries that stand to benefit from Nepal's development of renewable energy. And how would that happen? How would the focus in Nepal by investors help countries that are neighboring as well?
Well, I think this is, we're at the point of Nepal acting as a battery of South Asia, using its water resources and its solar resources to export that clean energy. So the bordering states of India and Bangladesh, which are immediately downstream from the glaciers and Nepal's rivers, are some of the poorest places in South Asia. They're highly vulnerable to climate change, and they're largely driven by thermal power. So just across the border in Uttar Pradesh in India is a 3,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant. Now that could be retired if Nepal was able to export. So last year, the governments of India and Nepal signed an agreement for Nepal to export up to 10,000 megawatts, and a similar deal is on the table for 5,000 megawatts to Bangladesh. Now, that would be transformational for Nepal's economy, but it would be also transformational for the problems of climate emission and black carbon that I spoke about earlier. So I think that's what we're all working on now, and that's what the new fund is about, is to back Nepal's growth in generation. There's a lot of work going on with the transmission grid and the cross-border capacity. And already this year, 1,200 megawatts is being exported at the peak of supply.
Now, Tim, when you were answering the last question, you referenced PPAs. I'm not sure that all of our listeners know what a power purchase agreement is about. Could you fill them in on that and help us understand how you might be tapping the fixed income markets as a part of that process?
Yeah, sorry for descending into jargon, but
That's okay. That's all right. It happens all the time.
Nepal has for 30 years developed power in hydropower originally, and now increasingly solar, through power purchase agreements. And that's with the government agency. So there's a sole buyer of electricity in Nepal. And what we found with our plants that are commissioned is they are very good payers. They pay on time every time. And that's been going on for 30 years. So while you might see Nepal, if you look at it on your Bloomberg screen and see there's no sovereign credit rating, you get a picture of Nepal. If you're on the ground receiving payments, you realize that actually they're good for it. And so we have a different view. What we are doing in the fixed income markets, because of that regular cash flow, is we are looking at launching the first international green bonds for Nepal to help power the debt side of this equation. Of course, our equity funds are focused on the equity, but we're looking at doing that. And we're doing that in conjunction with Guaranco, which, as I said, provide that wrap. So they will be AA- bonds, but of course they have a wrap from a guarantee company.
Okay. So those kinds of guarantees in the fixed income markets make a big difference in the quality of the bonds, as you just suggested. Are there any things, tell us about what key messages you really want investors to gather from this program conversation today, especially about the new Dolma Fund that is soon to be launched with a goal of raising $300 million to continue and expand renewable energy development in Nepal.
Well, I think so. Our new fund, it's the first vertical fund, as in it's the first one focused on renewable energy and climate transition. And that's really all about helping Nepal scale up for this incredible export opportunity to India and Bangladesh. On the equity side, Dolma Climate Fund will invest equity, of course, in renewable energy projects. It will be run-of-river hydro. A lot of people get scared about hydro and think huge dams blocking rivers. In Nepal, the velocity of water is enough that you just need a very low weir, and it's the velocity of the water that turns the turbine. And so it's much more environmentally friendly than those big storage dams. And increasingly solar power. Nepal's just done a bid for 800 megawatts additional solar power. There's very high levels of solar radiation in Nepal. So I think the opportunity for long-term investors in either equity, who can now benefit from our 10-year track record of returns, where we've built and commissioned 4 plants with another one under construction. 3 of those plants are listed on the stock exchange in Nepal, so have a mark-to-market valuation. So for the first time, foreign investors can see a track record of returns, and I would ask them to look at that. On the fixed income side, of course, we are launching a program of green bonds. And again, that will be with a Guaranco wrap, enabling us to get a high credit rating. But there's a vast amount of capital on the debt side as well. So I think if you're really looking to make an impact and prepared to go into some of the details with some of these blended finance and guarantee products which are available while respecting the fiduciary duty of large private sector investors, then Nepal should be a country that people should be looking at.
You know, Tim, we mentioned earlier that you started the Dolma Foundation as well in Nepal. Tell us a little bit, and have created over 15,000 jobs, and it sounds like there's a lot more employment opportunity coming for the people of Nepal through the work that you continue to do. Give us a little more detail on the foundation, how that's working to provide educational opportunities for young people in Nepal.
I mean, the way I look at the world, if you have a sort of development approach, is that the private sector and markets can do a lot, the most of the heavy lifting in terms of job creation, infrastructure, etc. But it can't do everything. So if you have a child in a poor household who has no education or no healthcare, there's no market solution to that. Philanthropy is the only solution. So while these are two completely separate organizations, one focused on market returns, one focused on pure development and not requiring the money to come back, Dolma Foundation is there to really boost education in some of the poorer areas of the mountains. We also do water projects, so doing fresh drinking water, and we also rebuilt an entire village after the earthquake. So you have to keep the capital completely separate. There's never a financial transaction between those two organizations. But I really see it as one continuum of development of the country.
That's great. Fantastic work in both cases, Tim. And where online can our followers learn more about the Dolma Impact Funds and the Dolma Foundation? And how can they get in touch with you to answer questions about the topics that we've covered in today's conversation?
I think the best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. And there's a link to my profile below. And the Dolma Fund Management website, as well as the Dolma Foundation website, if you're looking to donate, sponsor a child in Nepal, will also be provided in the links below.
Great. And if there are other documents or reports or anything that we can attach to this program, Tim, there are two places we can do that through our distribution network. So please provide us with anything that you would like people to have much more detail about and study on their own. So thanks again very much, Tim Gocher, CEO of the Dolma Impact Funds. And followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast can join me and my guest for another episode next week. Until then, this is Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.